Welcome to Tales of Justice. Today's story follows Henry Carter, a retired police captain who thought his days of fighting were behind him until a humiliating encounter with a corrupt officer, Brad Thompson, forces him back into the fray. What begins as a personal quest for dignity soon uncovers a deeper web of corruption within the police force, and Henry must decide just how far he's willing to go to expose the truth. Will justice prevail, or will the fight for it come at a price too high? If you're ready for a gripping story of revenge, justice, and moral dilemmas, be sure to subscribe, comment below, and let us know how you'd face this battle. Now, let's begin. Henry Carter squinted against the harsh Atlanta sunlight, carrying a small paper bag from the grocery store. The quiet neighborhood streets were familiar to him, places he had walked countless times during his career as a police officer. Now, retired and in his early 60s, Henry's days were calm. His routine simple mentoring local youth, working with civil rights groups, and making trips to the local market. The echo of his footsteps on the pavement was all that accompanied him until the low rumble of a police car broke the silence. Henry didn't think much of it. He had served nearly 30 years in the force, most of them on these very streets. He continued his slow walk home, but the sound of tires coming to a stop next to him drew his attention. "Hey!" The voice was sharp, authoritative. Henry turned toward the source, eyes narrowing slightly. A white police officer, young and full of arrogance, leaned out of the patrol car window. His eyes scanned Henry as if evaluating him, a look of disdain settling on his face. "You got a problem?" Henry asked, his tone calm but firm. He wasn't one to be intimidated, not after years of handling far worse situations. "Hands where I can see 'em," the officer barked, stepping out of the car with his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His name tag read Officer Brad Thompson. Henry complied, though the tension inside him began to build. This wasn't the first time he'd faced an unwarranted stop like this, but something about this officer's tone, the way his eyes seemed to challenge Henry's very presence, set him on edge. "What's the issue here?" Officer Henry asked, his voice measured. He had learned long ago how to keep his cool, but he could feel his patience thinning. Officer Thompson smirked, an unsettling smile creeping across his face. "You should know better than to ask questions like that. People like you." He let the words hang in the air, the venom in his voice clear. Henry's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what the officer meant, though he wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had fought for justice his entire life, both in and out of uniform, and he wasn't about to let some young officer with a chip on his shoulder get the better of him. Thompson walked up to Henry, towering over him, his smirk growing. "You think you're someone important? Huh? People like you should be grateful you're still walking around free." There it was again, that phrase. People like you. Henry had heard it in various forms throughout his life, from the subtle racism of his early career to the more overt, like now. But this time, it was different. The world had changed in some ways, but this moment felt as though time had stood still. The officer pushed Henry against the hood of the police car, his grip rough. The crowd that had gathered kept their distance, watching the scene unfold with quiet discomfort. He stood there, staring down at her with a look that felt colder than the shade they stood under. Henry clenched his fists but said nothing, his body rigid under the officer's touch. He was calculating now. Every insult, every shove, every act of intimidation was being stored away in his mind. This wasn't the time to fight back, but that didn't mean he would forget. "I'm a retired officer," Henry said, his voice calm, though a fire simmered beneath his words. Thompson paused for a moment, his hand freezing mid-search. "Retired," he scoffed, pushing Henry harder against the car. "From what? Security at a mall?" Henry said nothing, the humiliation digging deeper with every second. His muscles tensed, but he controlled himself. It was instinctual now, after decades of learning how to keep a cool head in the face of injustice. He knew that reacting here, in this moment, would play into exactly what this officer wanted. And Henry wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. As Henry stood there, pinned against the car, his mind drifted back through the years to a time when he wore the same uniform, a time when he held authority over men like Thompson, Henry Carter hadn't always been retired. He had once been a rising star in the Atlanta Police Department. Born and raised in the tough neighborhoods of the city, Henry had worked tirelessly to escape the poverty and violence that claimed so many of his childhood friends. Education had been his way out, and after excelling in school, he earned a scholarship to college, a rare achievement in his family. From the moment he entered the police academy, Henry had been determined to make a difference. He wasn't content to be just another officer patrolling the streets. He wanted to be a leader, someone who could reform the system from within. His time as a detective and later as a captain earned him the respect of his peers and the community alike. His no-nonsense approach and firm but fair attitude made him stand out. But the world he operated in was far from just. Corruption ran deep, and Henry had seen his fair share of officers who abused their power, officers like Brad Thompson, who wore the badge but didn't embody the values it was supposed to represent. It was the very thing Henry had tried to root out in his career, but it was also what had forced him into an early retirement. The battles he fought weren't just against criminals, they were against the broken system itself. And yet, here he was, years after retiring, still facing the same battles, still being judged not for who he was, but for the color of his skin. "You don't seem to understand who I am," Henry said quietly, the weight of his words heavy. He knew the system, the tricks, the games. He had played them before, only now he was on the other side. But Officer Thompson wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his own sense of power, too blinded by the authority his badge gave him. He shoved Henry one last time before stepping back, satisfied with his performance. "All clear," Thompson said mockingly. "You can go." The crowd slowly dispersed, people shaking their heads, but no one daring to intervene. Henry straightened up, his pride battered but not broken. He took a deep breath and began walking away, his steps slow but deliberate. As Henry walked, the weight of the humiliation bore down on him. He had been in situations far worse than this during his career, but something about today's encounter was different. It wasn't just the public humiliation or the way Officer Thompson had looked at him. It was the realization that, despite everything he had accomplished, despite all the barriers he had broken through, he was still seen as just another black man. For a brief moment, Henry felt an old anger bubbling up inside him, the kind of anger he hadn't felt since his youth. He wanted to turn around, to confront Officer Thompson, to remind him that the uniform didn't make him a man of honor, it was his actions that defined him. But Henry stopped himself. Years of training, years of hard-earned wisdom told him that now was not the time. He had learned long ago that direct confrontation rarely led to justice. Real justice was strategic, calculated. It required patience, something Henry had in abundance. As he neared his home, Henry's anger began to cool, replaced by something else, something much colder, much more determined. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that evening, sitting in his living room with the quiet hum of the city outside, Henry allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about his mother, about the lessons she had drilled into him since he was a boy. Respect and dignity are things that no one can take from you unless you allow them to. But today, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had allowed someone to take them. He felt the sting of that loss, but it wasn't crippling, it was motivating. Henry knew he had resources, people who owed him favors, and a network of contacts that stretched far beyond Atlanta. If Officer Brad Thompson thought he could get away with treating him like this, he was sorely mistaken. Henry Carter wasn't just any retired man. He was a man who had spent a lifetime fighting for justice, and now he was ready to fight again. Only this time he would do it his way, quietly, methodically, without ever raising his voice. As the night deepened, Henry's mind raced with possibilities. He wouldn't let this slide. He had tried for years to change the system from within, but maybe now it was time to work from the outside. This was no longer about him alone. It was about something much bigger. The stage was set, and the pieces were falling into place. Henry Carter had never been one for revenge, but this wasn't revenge. This was justice. And it was coming. The days following Henry Carter's encounter with Officer Brad Thompson were quiet, but deceptive. Henry's routine remained unchanged. He went on his usual walks, visited the local market, and exchanged greetings with neighbors. On the surface, he appeared calm, the same thoughtful man the community had always known. But beneath this calm exterior, Henry's mind was working constantly, replaying the events over and over. He thought about the way Officer Thompson had spoken to him, about the smug look on his face, and the weight of the public humiliation. Henry wasn't a man who easily lost his composure, but this wasn't something he could just let go. Not anymore. As he sat in his modest living room, the late afternoon light streaming through the windows, Henry reached for his phone. He hadn't made this call in years, but he knew it was time. "Clarence," Henry said when the line connected. "It's been a long time." On the other end, Clarence Matthews, an old colleague from Henry's days on the force, let out a warm chuckle. "Henry Carter, thought you'd retired for good. What can I do for you?" There was a pause before Henry spoke again. His voice was calm, but there was a steely resolve behind his words. "I need some information. It's about a certain Officer Brad Thompson." Clarence hesitated. "I've heard of him. Young guy. Kind of a hothead, if I recall." "That's putting it mildly," Henry said, the memory of the encounter still fresh. "I need to know if there's anything more to him. Something I can use." Clarence sighed, his tone shifting to one of understanding. "I'll see what I can dig up. But be careful, Henry. Things aren't as simple as they used to be." Henry thanked him and hung up, staring at the phone in his hand for a moment longer. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't looking for easy. He was looking for justice. As the days passed, Henry kept up appearances. He played the part of the retired man enjoying his quiet life, but inside, he was calculating. He knew the system all too well, the way it protected its own, the way certain things were swept under the rug. But he also knew how to work within that system, and he was going to use every tool at his disposal. A few days later, Henry received a call back from Clarence. His old friend's voice was graver this time, and Henry could sense the weight of what was about to be shared. "I dug around like you asked," Clarence began. "Thompson's got a file, all right, but it's thin. Most of it's been buried, but there's enough there to raise some serious questions. Complaints from civilians, allegations of excessive force, even whispers about taking bribes. Nothing ever stuck, though." Henry nodded, though Clarence couldn't see him. It was what he had expected. The system had protected Officer Thompson, just as it had so many others before him. "Send me what you've got," Henry said. "He'll take it from here." Later that evening, a file landed in Henry's inbox. He opened it and spent hours reading through every line, every report. Clarence had been right. There was enough to paint a picture of Brad Thompson as a reckless, corrupt officer, but not enough to convict him in the court of law. Yet. But Henry wasn't going to rely solely on the law. He had another plan in mind. As Henry sifted through the documents, he felt a pang of guilt creeping in. This wasn't the man he had been for most of his life. He had always believed in fairness, in the system, in justice that was earned, not taken. But now, after what had happened, he felt himself sliding toward a different kind of justice, one that wasn't served through the courts, but through strategic moves behind the scenes. Was he doing the right thing? Was this really about justice, or was it revenge? Henry leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had spent his entire career trying to root out corruption, to change the system from within. Now, as a retired man, he was finding that some things couldn't be changed from the inside. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. He thought about his mother's words again. "Respect and dignity are things that no one can take from you unless you allow them to." Henry closed the file and stood up, his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his dignity. Officer Thompson had tried to strip him of that, but Henry wasn't going to let it happen. The next few weeks were filled with quiet but deliberate actions. Henry reached out to more old contacts, journalists, former officers, even a few local politicians who remembered him from his days as a respected captain. He carefully pieced together a network of allies, each one willing to help him bring down Officer Thompson. One of those allies was David Brooks, a reporter for the Atlanta Sentinel. David had covered many of Henry's cases back in the day, and the two had formed a mutual respect for each other over the years. David had always been a truth-seeker, unafraid to expose corruption, and Henry knew he was the perfect person to help spread the word about Thompson's misconduct. They met at a small cafe, far from prying eyes. David, now in his 40s, still had the same energy and determination that Henry remembered from his earlier days as a journalist. He leaned forward, eager to hear what Henry had to say. "So, what have you got for me?" David asked, sipping his coffee. Henry handed over the file Clarence had given him. "This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's more out there. I'm sure of it." David flipped through the pages, his expression darkening as he read. "This is bad. Really bad. But you know this alone won't be enough. The department will protect him unless there's overwhelming evidence." Henry nodded. "I'm counting on you to dig deeper. Find the rest of it. I know it's out there. And when the time comes, we'll make sure the public knows exactly who Brad Thompson is." David looked up from the file, a glint of determination in his eyes. "You can count on me." As the investigation deepened, Henry remained patient. He knew this would take time. Brad Thompson was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He had likely covered his tracks well, but no one was untouchable, not if you knew where to look. David's report started small subtle articles about misconduct in the police force, investigations into officers abusing their power. He didn't name names, not yet, but the groundwork was being laid, and the public was starting to take notice. Meanwhile, Henry continued to live his life as though nothing had changed. He went to the market, greeted his neighbors, and attended community events. But inside, he was waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment came sooner than he expected. One morning, a headline in the Atlanta Sentinel caught the city's attention. "Internal Affairs opens investigation into police misconduct allegations." The article was vague, but it hinted at something much bigger. It mentioned allegations of corruption, excessive force, and the mishandling of cases enough to stir curiosity among the public, but not enough to reveal the full story. Not yet. Inside the police department, however, the article had sent shockwaves. Officers were whispering in the hallways, wondering who was under investigation. And Brad Thompson, he was starting to sweat. Henry watched from the sidelines, knowing that this was just the beginning. He had been careful to stay out of the spotlight, letting David and his contacts do the heavy lifting. But now, with the investigation gaining traction, it was time for Henry to step back in. He made his way to the police station, his old stomping grounds where he knew Thompson would be. The air was thick with tension when Henry walked through the doors. Officers who once respected him nodded in his direction, unsure of why he was there. And then, Henry saw him Officer Brad Thompson leaning against a desk, his usual cocky smirk faltering as he noticed Henry's presence. "Well, well," Thompson said, pushing himself off the desk and walking toward Henry. "If it isn't the old man. Come to file another complaint." Henry didn't flinch. He met Thompson's gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to file a complaint," he said quietly. "I'm here to watch you face the consequences of your actions." Thompson's smile wavered. "You think you've got something on me? Think again. I run this place." "That's where you're wrong," Henry replied, his voice steady. "You don't run anything. And soon, everyone will know exactly what kind of man you are." At that moment, David Brooks entered the station, camera in hand. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. This was going to be public. Very public. Thompson's face turned pale as David began filming. He glanced around, noticing the eyes of his colleagues on him. For the first time, the smug confidence was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. "You're finished," Henry said, his voice low but firm. "It's only a matter of time." Thompson didn't respond. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. As Henry watched him leave, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and something else, something darker. This wasn't just about taking down one man anymore. It was about something much bigger. And for the first time, Henry began to wonder if he was prepared for what came next. As the investigation deepened, Henry knew that Brad Thompson wasn't going to go down without a fight. The officer had too much to lose, and desperate men made dangerous choices. Sure enough, rumors began circulating that Thompson was trying to gather allies within the department, officers who would vouch for him and help cover up his actions. But Henry had anticipated this. He had been one step ahead from the beginning, and now he was ready to take the next step. He continued working behind the scenes, quietly but effectively. More and more information began to surface, witnesses who had been too afraid to speak up before. Documents that had been buried, but not forgotten. With each new revelation, Thompson's grip on his career weakened. But Henry wasn't just relying on the investigation. He was preparing for the inevitable retaliation. Thompson, cornered and desperate, would strike back. And when he did, Henry would be ready. The Atlanta Sentinel's investigation into Officer Brad Thompson's misconduct was making waves, but it wasn't the full storm yet. The public was just beginning to realize the depth of corruption within the police force, and Henry Carter's carefully orchestrated plan was inching toward its final stages. The real bombshell came when David Brooks, after weeks of relentless digging, published a front-page expose a corrupt network inside the scandal-shaking Atlanta's police force. The article outlined not only Officer Thompson's abuses, but hinted at a wider web of corruption within the department. It mentioned senior officers who had turned a blind eye to Thompson's behavior, local politicians with ties to illegal activities, and the system's failure to protect the public from rogue officers like him. Henry sat at his kitchen table early one morning, the newspaper spread before him. He read through David's article with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Every paragraph was another step closer to justice, another blow to the man who had humiliated him and to the system that had enabled men like Brad Thompson. The article didn't mention Henry by name. He had insisted on staying out of the public eye as much as possible. This wasn't about his own glory, it was about making sure that the truth came to light, and that Thompson was held accountable for his actions. But he knew his involvement was an open secret among those who mattered. Officer Thompson, meanwhile, was facing increasing pressure. The investigation was moving faster than he had anticipated, and his allies within the force were growing wary. The public outcry was mounting, and internal affairs had begun combing through years of his service record, pulling up every complaint, every questionable incident. The atmosphere at the police station was tense. Officers who had once laughed and joked with Thompson were now keeping their distance. They knew the investigation wasn't just targeting him, it was threatening to expose a culture of corruption that had existed for years, and no one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. Thompson, once so confident in his power, was beginning to feel the walls closing in. He knew he was being watched, that every move he made was scrutinized, and yet he refused to go down without a fight. Behind the scenes, he was still pulling strings, still trying to salvage what was left of his career. But Henry wasn't done yet. He knew Thompson would strike back, it was in his nature. And that's exactly what Henry was counting on. It wasn't long before Brad Thompson made his move. Late one night, as Henry sat in his living room, going over the latest developments in the case, he received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. Stop what you're doing, or there'll be consequences. Henry's first instinct was anger. It was a threat, plain and simple an attempt to intimidate him into backing down. But Henry had faced worse in his years on the force, and this was going to scare him off. He hung up the phone without responding, but he knew this was only the beginning. 2 nights later, there was a break-in at Henry's home. The intruders didn't take anything of value, they didn't even try to. It was a message meant to unsettle him. Drawers were left open, personal belongings scattered, but nothing was stolen. Henry wasn't rattled, though. He had anticipated this. In fact, he had prepared for it. The break-in was sloppy, just as Henry had expected it would be. Thompson wasn't a man of subtlety, and his desperation was making him careless. Henry had installed security cameras around his home the moment he began putting his plan into motion. The footage clearly captured 2 men breaking in, their faces partially covered, but not enough to hide their identities completely. The following morning, Henry made a call to an old friend in law enforcement, LT. Sarah Johnson, a detective who had worked with Henry during his time on the force. Sarah was one of the few people Henry trusted implicitly. She had always been a straight shooter, unwilling to bend the rules for anyone, no matter how high-ranking. Sarah came to Henry's house that afternoon to review the footage. She was quiet as she watched the men enter, rummage through the house, and leave without taking anything. "Thompson sent them," Henry said, his voice calm. Sarah nodded. "Looks that way. He'll take care of it." Henry trusted Sarah to handle the situation, but he knew this was just the beginning. Thompson was lashing out because he knew he was losing control. But Henry wasn't going to let Thompson turn the tables on him. Not now. Days passed, and the break-in was investigated, but there was little official action. Thompson had connections enough to stall the investigation temporarily. But Henry wasn't relying on the official channels anymore. He had his own plan. David Brooks, the journalist, had been working quietly behind the scenes, gathering more evidence on Thompson and his corrupt allies. And now, with the break-in as a new piece of the puzzle, David was ready to publish a follow-up story, a story that would leave no room for Thompson to hide. The article hit the front page of the Atlanta Sentinel with a headline that no one could ignore: "Officer Behind Investigation Linked to Intimidation, Corruption Scandal Widens." It detailed the break-in at Henry's house, the ongoing investigation into Thompson's conduct, and hinted at deeper corruption within the force. Thompson's response was immediate and predictable. He issued a public statement claiming that the allegations were false, that he was being targeted unfairly, and that the investigation was a witch hunt. But the damage had been done. Public opinion was turning against him, and even his remaining allies within the department were starting to distance themselves. Henry watched it all unfold from the sidelines, satisfied but still cautious. He knew Thompson wasn't done yet. The man was too proud, too arrogant to go down without a final fight. The final confrontation between Henry and Thompson came sooner than Henry expected. One evening, as Henry returned home from a community meeting, he found Thompson waiting for him. The officer was leaning against his car, arms crossed, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. "We need to talk," Thompson said, his voice tense. Henry approached slowly, keeping his distance. He wasn't afraid. He had dealt with men like Thompson before. But he wasn't foolish either. About what Henry asked, his tone even. Thompson straightened, his eyes narrowing. "You need to back off. You've stirred up a lot of trouble, and it's going to get worse for you if you don't stop." Henry felt a wave of calm wash over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Thompson, stripped of his bravado, showed his true colors. The officer wasn't invincible, and he knew it. "You brought this on yourself," Henry said, his voice steady. "You thought you could get away with it because the system protected you. But the truth is out now. There's no going back." Thompson's face twisted in frustration. "You think you've won? This isn't over. I still have people on my side." Henry shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "Not anymore. Your people are cutting ties because they know you're a liability. You're finished." Thompson took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You don't know who you're messing with." Henry didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Thompson's. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. And so does everyone else." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them thick. Then, without another word, Thompson turned and walked away, leaving Henry standing in the driveway, watching him go. Thompson's public downfall came shortly after that confrontation. Internal Affairs completed their investigation, and the evidence against Thompson was overwhelming. The break-in at Henry's house, the corruption, the misuse of power, it was all laid bare. Thompson was suspended from the force, and criminal charges were filed. The public trial was a spectacle. Reporters lined the courtroom, capturing every detail. Henry sat quietly in the back, watching as Thompson's fate was sealed. The officer, once so confident and untouchable, now looked pale and defeated. His lawyers tried to downplay the charges, but the evidence was too strong. The jury took less than a day to reach a verdict: guilty. Thompson was sentenced to prison for his crimes: abuse of power, intimidation, and corruption. As he was led away in handcuffs, Henry felt a sense of closure, but also something else, an emptiness. He had won, but the victory wasn't as sweet as he had imagined. In the days that followed the trial, Henry found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had spent months bringing down a corrupt officer, exposing a network of corruption, and seeking justice for the humiliation he had endured. But now, with Thompson behind bars, Henry felt an unexpected weight on his shoulders. Had he done the right thing? Was this really about justice, or had it been about revenge? He had used the system, manipulated events, and orchestrated a man's downfall just as Thompson had done to others. Henry wasn't a man prone to self-doubt, but this time was different. He had won, but at what cost? The courtroom was a flurry of noise and camera flashes as Brad Thompson was led away in handcuffs. For many, it was a victory, one corrupt officer exposed and held accountable, a small but significant blow to a system that had long been criticized for its abuses. Henry Carter sat quietly in the back, watching it all unfold. His expression remained unreadable as the world moved on around him. Thompson was gone, but Henry's sense of satisfaction was fleeting. It wasn't just the complexity of the emotions swirling inside him. It was the quiet realization that this victory had come at a cost. The legal process was far from over, and the network of corruption uncovered during the investigation wasn't going down without a fight. Thompson's conviction was only the beginning, and Henry knew that forces larger than one rogue officer was now in play. That evening, Henry returned to his modest home, where the silence felt heavier than usual. He sat down at his kitchen table, staring at the newspaper on the counter. The headlines screamed about Thompson's conviction, painting the officer as the villain Henry knew he was. But despite the headlines, Henry couldn't shake the hollow feeling gnawing at him. He had spent his entire career believing in the power of justice, of fighting corruption from the inside out. But now, for the first time, he questioned whether he had crossed a line. Had this been about justice, or had he been consumed by a thirst for revenge? Every move he'd made, every step he took to bring Thompson down, had been calculated. The plan had worked flawlessly, but the question remained, what had it cost him? As the days passed, Henry found it harder to reconcile the victory with the growing unease inside him. His old friends in the force called to congratulate him, and the community praised him for standing up against the corruption. But with each well-wisher, Henry felt more isolated. No one saw the full picture. They didn't know the lengths he had gone to ensure that Thompson paid for what he had done. A week after Thompson's conviction, Henry received an unexpected visitor. Lilte, Sarah Johnson, the detective who had helped Henry with the break-in investigation, arrived at his doorstep with a serious expression. She didn't waste any time. "Henry, we need to talk," she said, stepping inside. He offered her a seat, but she remained standing, her arms crossed. "What's going on?" Henry asked, sensing the urgency in her demeanor. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Thompson's conviction stirred up more than we expected. The investigation into his corruption has exposed something bigger, a network of officers and politicians who've been covering up illegal activities for years. We're talking about drug trafficking, money laundering, even connections to organized crime." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected that Thompson wasn't working alone, but he hadn't anticipated that the corruption ran this deep. "How many people are involved?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "It's hard to say right now, but I can tell you this. The people we're dealing with won't go down without a fight. They've been protecting each other for years, and now that we've exposed part of it, they're going to push back. Hard." Henry sat back in his chair, absorbing the weight of what Sarah was telling him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed, Henry began to feel the pressure of what he had set in motion. The investigation into Thompson's network widened, and the deeper it went, the more dangerous it became. There were whispers in the press, anonymous threats made against those involved in the investigation, and an unsettling tension in the air. Henry knew that he had become a target, whether he liked it or not. His role in bringing down Thompson had made him a symbol of resistance against the corrupt system. And now, those who had profited from that system were looking for a way to protect themselves. If that meant taking Henry down, so be it. Late one night, Henry received another anonymous call. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't distorted. It was calm, measured. "Mr. Carter," the voice began, "you've made a lot of powerful enemies. I suggest you back off before things get worse for you." Henry didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. Whoever was behind the network Thompson had been part of was watching, and they were prepared to escalate. But Henry wasn't going to back down. He had spent his life fighting for justice, and now, even in retirement, that fight wasn't over. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away, not when so much was at stake. Henry's involvement in the investigation didn't go unnoticed. His contacts in law enforcement warned him to be cautious, and David Brooks, the journalist, advised him to stay out of the spotlight for a while. But Henry wasn't one to sit on the sidelines. He began working more closely with Sarah and her team, offering insights into the inner workings of the department and the corrupt network they were trying to expose. The investigation became more dangerous as they uncovered new layers of corruption. Several high-ranking officials were implicated, and the case began to take on a life of its own. The media frenzy intensified, and the public demanded accountability. As the pressure mounted, Henry found himself thrust into the center of the storm. His past career as a police officer gave him credibility with the media, and his moral stance against corruption made him a symbol of integrity. But the attention also made him a target. One evening, as Henry returned home from another meeting with Sarah and the investigative team, he found his front door ajar. The quiet Atlanta street seemed eerie in the fading light, and a knot formed in Henry's stomach. Cautiously, he stepped inside. The house was dark, but something felt off. His instincts, honed by years on the force, kicked in. He reached for his phone, but paused as he heard footsteps upstairs. His heart raced, but Henry didn't panic. He moved quietly, approaching the staircase. The creak of a floorboard above told him he wasn't alone. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs, a man, face covered in a mask, but clearly caught off guard by Henry's presence. For a split second, they locked eyes, and the intruder hesitated before bolting down the hallway. Henry didn't give chase. Instead, he stepped back, grabbed his phone, and dialed Sarah. "Get a team here now," he said, his voice steady but urgent. The man escaped before the police arrived, but the message was clear. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a direct threat to Henry's life. The corrupt network wasn't going to let him walk away from this fight unscathed. After the break-in, Henry's sense of isolation deepened. The battle he was fighting felt larger than ever before, and now his own safety was on the line. Sarah and her team increased security around Henry's home. But even with the added precautions, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was still lurking in the shadows. He spent long hours sitting on his porch, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Atlanta had been his home for decades, and he had dedicated his life to protecting it. But now, he wondered if the fight he was in was worth the cost. The threats were becoming more personal, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. As Henry sat there, his mind drifted back to his mother's words, "Respect and dignity are things that no one can take from you unless you allow them to." He had lived by those words for his entire life, but now they felt like a challenge. Could he continue this fight without losing a part of himself? Was the quest for justice worth the personal toll it was taking? For the first time, Henry wasn't sure. Despite the threats and the personal risks, Henry knew he couldn't walk away. The investigation had uncovered too much, and the fight against the corrupt network wasn't just about him. It was about the future of the city, the integrity of the system, and the people who had been victimized by those in power. Tears welled in Alyssa's eyes as she spoke, but she pressed on. "We need to take this all the way," Henry said, his voice firm. "No more holding back. We expose everything." Sarah nodded. "We're close, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. You know that, right?" "I do," Henry replied, "but I'm not backing down." The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, meetings, and strategy sessions. Henry worked closely with the investigative team, providing them with every bit of information he could gather from his old contacts. The investigation widened, and more officials were implicated. It wasn't just about Thompson anymore. It was about a system that had been corrupt for far too long. The final tipping point came when a new piece of evidence surfaced: documents linking several high-ranking city officials to illegal activities. It was the smoking gun the team had been searching for, and it was enough to bring the entire network crashing down. David Brooks published the expose, and the fallout was immediate. Arrests were made, resignations followed, and the city was plunged into a full-blown scandal. The media swarmed the story, and Henry's role in exposing the corruption became the focus of national attention. But even as the public celebrated the victory, Henry knew the fight wasn't over. The corrupt system had been weakened, but it wasn't gone. There would always be those who tried to exploit power for personal gain, and the battle for justice would continue long after he was gone. The fallout from David Brooks' expose was seismic. Atlanta was gripped by scandal as news outlets across the country covered the downfall of the city's corrupt elite. The high-ranking officials implicated in the investigation were either forced to resign or arrested. The network of corruption, which had thrived in the shadows for years, was finally brought into the light. For the public, it was a moment of triumph. But for Henry Carter, the aftermath was bittersweet. In the days following the expose, Henry found himself bombarded with attention. Journalists sought interviews, community leaders hailed him as a hero, and former colleagues reached out to congratulate him. But Henry, now in his early 60s, felt the weight of it all bearing down on him. One morning, as he sat on his porch, watching the world go by, he received a call from David Brooks. "You did it, Henry," David said, his voice full of admiration. "You took down the whole network." Henry paused, staring out at the Atlanta skyline. "We did it, David. This was a team effort." "Maybe," David replied, "but none of this would have happened without you. The city owes you a debt it can never repay." Henry didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, lingering on the personal cost of the battle he'd fought. Despite the victory, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost along the way. He had spent months pulling strings, gathering allies, and navigating a dangerous game of strategy to take down Brad Thompson and the corrupt network. But in doing so, he had crossed lines he never thought he would. For years, Henry had believed in the power of justice. But now, in the quiet moments of reflection, he questioned whether the justice he had sought had come at too high a price. Was the system truly any better than it had been before? Or had he simply traded one form of corruption for another? Henry had used his connections, manipulated events, and orchestrated the downfall of men who had done wrong. But had he become like them in the process? The question haunted him. That evening, as the sun set over Atlanta, Henry sat alone in his living room. The shadows stretched across the walls, and the silence felt heavier than ever. He had won the battle, but had he lost a piece of himself in the process? The weeks following the scandal were quiet for Henry. The city had moved on, consumed by the next big news story, and the public's attention had shifted. But Henry remained in the background, grappling with his internal struggle. One afternoon, as Henry walked through his neighborhood, he stopped by a local park where he often mentored young men. Today, the park was empty, save for a few children playing in the distance. He sat down on a bench, watching them, and his mind drifted back to his own youth. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Respect and dignity are things that no one can take from you unless you allow them to." But had he allowed Thompson and the system to take something from him? Had his thirst for justice turned into something darker, something he no longer recognized? Henry's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Sarah Johnson, the detective who had been his ally throughout the investigation. He answered the call, his voice weary. "Henry," Sarah began, "I wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Henry replied, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. "You don't sound fine," Sarah said gently. "This whole thing, it took a lot out of all of us." Henry sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I thought I knew what I was fighting for, Sarah. But now I'm not so sure." Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. "You fought for justice. You exposed the truth. But no one said the truth was easy." Henry smiled faintly, though there was little humor in it. "Maybe not. But I wonder if I went too far. Sometimes doing the right thing feels wrong in the moment," Sarah said. "But you've always been a man of integrity, Henry. You didn't do this for revenge. You did it because it was the right thing to do." Henry didn't reply immediately. He appreciated Sarah's words, but the doubt lingered. The line between justice and revenge had become blurred, and he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. As the days passed, Henry began to find a sense of peace, albeit slowly. The city was changing, and reforms were being put in place within the police department. New leadership had been appointed, and efforts were being made to rebuild trust between the community and law enforcement. Henry continued his work mentoring young people, guiding them away from the pitfalls of crime and violence. He had always believed in the power of education and mentorship, and now, more than ever, he saw it as his way of making a difference. One evening, after a community meeting, Henry was approached by a young man named Marcus. He was in his early 20s, a familiar face from the neighborhood, but someone who had always kept to himself. "I just wanted to say thanks, Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his voice quiet but sincere. Henry raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For everything you've done," Marcus replied. "I know things are messed up, but what you did exposing all that corruption, it matters." Was the documentation unclear? Or was it simply that you didn't believe her? And guys like me were paying attention. Henry felt a flicker of hope stir inside him. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said gently. "I did it because it needed to be done. But the real change, that's on you and the others like you. You're the future, Marcus. Don't ever forget that." Marcus nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "I won't, and I won't forget what you did either." As Marcus walked away, Henry felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The doubts still lingered, but moments like this reminded him of why he had fought so hard. The battle against corruption wasn't over, but there were new voices ready to carry the fight forward. With time, Henry began to accept that the fight for justice was never clean, and it was never over. Next, Officer Morgan was called to the stand. But as long as people like Marcus were out there, willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope. Henry returned to his work with renewed energy, focusing on the future instead of dwelling on the past. He continued to work with the community, using his experience to mentor the next generation of leaders. And though the shadow of his battle with Thompson still hung over him, it no longer weighed him down. In the quiet moments, when the doubts crept in, Henry reminded himself that justice was a journey, not a destination. He had fought his battle, and now it was time for others to pick up where he left off. Months after Thompson's conviction, Henry received a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer representing one of the victims who had come forward during the investigation. The letter thanked Henry for his role in exposing the corruption that had allowed Thompson and his associates to operate with impunity. Enclosed was a note from the victim herself, a woman who had been ignored by the system for years. Her words were simple, but they carried a deep sense of gratitude. "You gave me back my voice." Henry sat with the letter for a long time, the weight of those words settling over him. In the end, it wasn't about the system or the headlines. It wasn't even about the personal battle he had fought with Brad Thompson. It was about the people who had been silenced, who had suffered in the shadows, and who now had a chance to be heard. And that, more than anything else, gave Henry a sense of peace. The sun was setting over Atlanta as Henry sat on his porch, watching the city come to life in the fading light. The streets were filled with the sounds of laughter, of life moving forward, and Henry felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had done his part. He had fought for justice, exposed corruption, and in the end, he had made a difference. The city wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that was enough. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Henry closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The battle was over, but the legacy of his fight would endure. As Henry Carter reflected on his journey, one filled with challenges, moral dilemmas, and a relentless pursuit of justice, he knew that the fight wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone willing to stand up for what's right. His story was one of courage, integrity, and resilience, and he hoped it would inspire others to act in their own lives. If you found this story moving, powerful, or thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on more narratives that challenge injustice, uplift voices, and reflect the world we all live in. Your support helps us continue to bring you stories that inspire change and shed light on important issues. Hit the subscribe button, share this story with friends, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we can keep the conversation going and help build a future where justice prevails for all. It made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't being seen as a person who needed help, but as someone who was trying to take advantage of the system. And what happened when the officers arrived? Samuel asked gently. Alyssa swallowed hard. They treated me like a criminal. They questioned me over and over, even though I had already shown them my medical papers. They refused to listen, and they made me feel small, like I was less than. As she spoke, Alyssa could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her. The memories of that day were still raw, still painful. She could see Marcus' frightened face, hear the judgment in the officers' voices. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Samuel stepped back slightly. Alyssa, is it fair to say that this experience caused you significant emotional distress? Alyssa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Thank you, Alyssa, Samuel said softly. No further questions. As Alyssa prepared to step down, Lisa Harding rose from the defense table. Her eyes were sharp as she approached, and Alyssa braced herself for the cross-examination. Mrs. Grant, Lisa began, her voice cool, you've stated that the officers made you feel like a criminal. But isn't it true that you refused to cooperate with their requests for additional verification? Alyssa stiffened. I didn't refuse to cooperate. I showed them my medical papers, but they ignored them. But the officers were following protocol, correct, Lisa pressed. They were simply doing their job. Alyssa's anger flared. Their job wasn't to treat me like I was lying. I did everything I was supposed to do, and they still didn't believe me. Lisa's smile was thin, almost condescending. So, you felt disrespected. But would you agree that the officers had a responsibility to ensure that the system wasn't being abused? We have a rich history here in Silver Creek, Mayor Parker began, addressing the gathered crowd. She knew what Lisa was doing, trying to twist the narrative, trying to make it seem like the officers had been reasonable. They had a responsibility to treat me like a human being, Alyssa said, her voice shaking. But they didn't. Lisa Harding's smile faltered slightly, and she stepped back. No further questions. As Alyssa stepped down from the stand, her legs felt weak. She had spoken her truth, but she wasn't sure if it would be enough. The trial stretched on for several more days, with both sides presenting their arguments. Samuel continued to build a strong case, highlighting the officers' failure to follow proper procedures and the emotional toll the incident had taken on Alyssa and her family. But Lisa Harding and the defense fought back just as hard, trying to paint the officers as professionals simply doing their jobs. By the time the closing statements were made, Alyssa felt emotionally drained. She sat beside Ethan, holding his hand tightly as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The room was silent as the judge spoke. After reviewing the evidence and the testimonies provided, it is clear that the officers involved acted inappropriately in their handling of Mrs. Grant's situation. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. They had won, but the judge's next words tempered her relief. However, while the court recognizes the distress caused, the damages awarded will be limited, as the defense has shown that there was no intent to cause harm. Alyssa exhaled slowly, her emotions a mixture of relief and disappointment. They had won, but it wasn't the complete victory she had hoped for. As the courtroom emptied, Samuel approached Alyssa and Ethan. "We did it," he said with a small smile. "It's not everything we wanted, but it's a step in the right direction." Alyssa nodded, her heart still heavy. She had hoped for more accountability, more justice. But as she looked around at the people who had supported her, she realized that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Ethan squeezed her hand. "We're going to keep pushing. This isn't the end." Alyssa smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "No, it's not," she agreed. "We've come this far, and we're not stopping now." The days following the trial were a whirlwind of mixed emotions for Alyssa and Ethan. They had won the case, but the limited damages awarded felt like a hollow victory. The media portrayed it as a triumph, but for Alyssa, there was a lingering sense of unfinished business. The police department issued a short statement acknowledging the court's decision, but refused to accept any direct blame. There was no public apology, no disciplinary actions against the officers involved, just silence, as if the whole ordeal was something they wanted to forget. Ethan tried to stay positive, constantly reminding Alyssa of the progress they had made. "We forced them to acknowledge their mistake," he said one evening, as they sat together in the living room. "That's something." Alyssa nodded, but her heart was heavy. "It doesn't feel like enough," she admitted. "We went through all of that, and they still get to walk away like it didn't matter." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "It mattered. It mattered to the people who saw what happened, the people who are standing with us now. This is bigger than just one case." Alyssa knew he was right. The outpouring of support from the community had been overwhelming. Messages of encouragement flooded her social media, and people she had never met reached out to thank her for standing up against injustice. Tanya, who had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal, visited them often. "We've opened the door for change," she said during one of her visits. "The fight isn't over, but you've made people listen." Still, the weight of what they had been through lingered. Alyssa felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't fully processed the toll the trial had taken on her, and the public scrutiny that followed didn't help. There were still hateful comments online, people who insisted that she had overreacted, that she was trying to make something out of nothing. But Alyssa refused to let the negativity silence her. She had come too far to back down now. A few weeks after the trial, Samuel Green contacted Alyssa and Ethan with some surprising news. A civil rights organization had taken notice of their case and wanted to partner with them in pushing for broader reform. They were calling for changes in police training, particularly around how officers handle interactions with people of color and those with disabilities. "We're going to push for systemic changes," Samuel explained during their meeting. The lawsuit was just the first step. Now we need to focus on changing the policies that allow things like this to happen in the first place. Alyssa felt a flicker of hope. This was exactly what she had wanted, the chance to prevent others from going through what she had experienced. Tanya was equally enthusiastic. "Well, organize another rally," she said, her eyes alight with determination. "This time, we're not just demanding justice for you. We're demanding changes that will protect everyone." The rally, held in front of the courthouse, drew even larger crowds than the first one. Alyssa stood at the center of it all, feeling the energy of the people around her, people who believed in what she was fighting for, people who wanted to see real change. This time, Alyssa felt stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and mistreated. As she took the stage to speak, the crowd quieted. Alyssa's voice rang out, clear and steady. "I stood here months ago to tell you my story. Today, I'm here to tell you that the fight for justice isn't over. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people who look like me, people who live with disabilities, people who are treated like they don't belong." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support. "We deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who we are or where we come from," Alyssa continued. "And we won't stop until the system changes, until officers are held accountable, until our communities feel safe, and until everyone is seen for who they are, not just the assumptions made about them." As the rally continued, Alyssa felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. In the months that followed, Alyssa and Ethan's lives slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. The media attention faded, and the constant pressure of the trial eased. But Alyssa's fight for justice didn't end, it simply shifted. She and Ethan became advocates, speaking at events, partnering with civil rights organizations, and working with local lawmakers to push for reforms in police training. Their case became a touchstone for broader conversations about race, disability, and the treatment of marginalized communities. For Alyssa, the most important change was within herself. She had gone from feeling powerless to finding her voice, and now she was using that voice to help others. Her strength, which had been tested in ways she never imagined, had only grown stronger. One evening, as Alyssa and Ethan sat on the porch watching Marcus play in the yard, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. "I didn't think we'd get here," Alyssa said quietly, leaning her head against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan smiled, wrapping his arm around her. We've come a long way. Alyssa watched Marcus laugh and run, her heart swelling with love for him. Do you think he'll remember what happened? She asked softly. Ethan thought for a moment. Maybe. But if he does, he'll remember how strong you were, how you stood up for yourself and for him. Alyssa smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. I just want him to know that we did the right thing. He knows, Ethan said gently. We all know. Months turned into a year, and while the initial urgency of the trial had passed, the changes that Alyssa and Ethan had fought for were starting to take root. The police department, under pressure from the public and local leaders, began implementing new training protocols. Officers were required to undergo sensitivity training focused on racial bias and disability awareness. It wasn't a complete overhaul, but it was a step in the right direction. Alyssa and Ethan continued to speak out, using their platform to raise awareness and push for further reforms. They met with other families who had experienced similar injustices, offering support and guidance. One day, as Alyssa was preparing for another speaking event, she received an unexpected call from the police department's new chief, who had been brought in after the fallout from the trial. I wanted to reach out to you personally, the chief said, his tone respectful. I know the department has a long way to go, but I want you to know that we're committed to making things better. What happened to you should never have happened, and we're working to ensure it doesn't happen again. Alyssa was taken aback by the call. It wasn't a formal apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had received from the department since the trial. Thank you, Alyssa replied, her voice steady. I appreciate that. But I'll be watching closely to make sure those changes happen. The chief chuckled lightly. I wouldn't expect anything less. As Alyssa hung up the phone, she felt a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like real progress was being made. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Alyssa, Ethan, and Marcus returned to Greenview Amusement Park. It had been over a year since the confrontation, and though Alyssa had been reluctant to return, Ethan had convinced her that it was time to reclaim the space that had once brought them so much pain. As they walked through the gates, Alyssa felt a mix of emotions. Memories of that day flooded her mind, but alongside them came a sense of strength. She had faced her fear, fought for justice, and emerged stronger on the other side. Mom, can we go on the Ferris wheel? Marcus asked, his voice filled with excitement. Alyssa smiled down at him, her heart swelling with pride. Of course we can, she said. Let's go. As they approached the ride, Alyssa noticed the park had made some changes. The accessibility lines were more clearly marked, and staff members greeted them with warmth and respect. It was a small but significant Victoria sign that slowly but surely things were changing. As the Ferris wheel lifted them into the sky, Alyssa looked out over the park, the sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. She glanced at Ethan, who smiled back at her, and then at Marcus, whose laughter filled the air. In that moment, Alyssa felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for justice. And while the fight was far from over, she knew they were heading in the right direction. They had faced the odds and emerged stronger, and now, together, they looked to the future with hope. The story of Alyssa and Ethan's fight for justice became a symbol of hope and resilience. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about standing up against a system that too often overlooked the people it was meant to protect. Their story inspired others to come forward, to share their own experiences, and to demand better from the institutions that were supposed to serve them. Alyssa's journey wasn't easy, but in the end, she had found her strength not just for herself, but for her family and her community. And while the fight for justice continued, Alyssa knew that together they could make a difference. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If Alyssa's journey for justice and resilience inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark hope and bring light to issues that matter. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next upload, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in the ongoing fight for change. Stay tuned for more stories that uplift, inspire, and push for a better tomorrow. He paused, locking eyes with the jury. We have a chance today to show that Silver Creek is a place where everyone is valued, where justice prevails. Let's not waste that chance. The jury's decision when it came was a victory for Ethan's client and for the town as a whole. The verdict sent a clear message: Silver Creek was ready to move forward, to embrace the values of equality and justice that Ethan and Nia had fought so hard for. The victory in the courtroom marked the beginning of a new chapter for Silver Creek. Slowly but surely, the town was becoming a place where people felt safe to speak out, to stand up for what they believed in. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still pockets of resistance, but the progress was undeniable. Ethan and Nia, though still facing challenges, felt a sense of peace they hadn't known in a long time. They had fought for their love, for justice, and for the future of Silver Creek, and now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan turned to Nia, a soft smile on his lips. "You know," he said, his voice filled with affection, "when I first met you, I had no idea how much my life would change." Nia chuckled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You had no idea how much you'd change mine." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We've come so far. Sometimes I still can't believe everything we've been through." Nia nodded, her heart full. "It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." As they sat together, the quiet of the evening surrounding them, Nia thought about the journey they had been on, the battles they had fought, the love they had shared, and the future they had helped create. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. "Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible. People like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love, it was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything.